Okay, so I think we're gonna wait a few more minutes and actually, you know what? Let's just get started now. All right. So while participants are coming in, let's just start off. So today we're going to be talking about genetics. So do you think, so if anyone has heard this word before, can they just like unmute and describe like what they think the definition is? Like, don't be shy, just a guess. Anyone?
It's the science of genes?
It's a branch of biology that studies genes and what traits we pass down.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, good answers, guys. That's pretty much it. So today we're going to elaborate on um, what genetics is and then how people use it to, do good. So like in medicine and everything. So let's start off with the basics of genetics. So to understand genetics, what you have to understand first is the building block of essentially all your cells, pretty much, like what tells your cells what to do. And this is DNA. So a lot of you may have heard of DNA before. So first think about how many trillions and trillions of cells are in your body already, okay? So these cells are really diverse. Like you can have bone cells that store calcium and they become really hard, and then you have eye cells which make a special pigment, and then yeah. So the instructions for cells, how they know what to do, are stored in a special instruction molecule called DNA. So if you think about the differences between you and your neighbor, your parents, and your friends, all of these are due to differences in our DNA. So because our DNA sequences are different, that's why our characteristics are different. So people with black eyes, they have instructions that tell their cells to make more or darker pigment than people with blue eyes, for example. So DNA is a really long molecule, and it looks a bit like a helix, like this. It's like a ladder, except it's all twisty. So in the cell, DNA is coiled up into really, really tight coils called chromosomes. We'll take a look at those later. And it's stored in a tiny compartment in the cell, in the middle of the cell, called nucleus for most cells. So each cell is able to read this DNA and use these instructions to make proteins. So imagine like a really long receipt, like the one you get at a pharmacy, like CVS or something. Imagine a person is reading that and it's like instructions for something. So the cell uses DNA sequences as instructions for making proteins. So you may have heard of proteins being in your food or whatever, except proteins aren't just that. They're molecules that are responsible for pretty much everything in your body. So anything that you can think of, like digesting food, like structural roles, like keeping your tissues rough and everything, all of that is because of proteins. Proteins are just really what what your body uses to do pretty much everything. So now let's get on to genes. So that's where the word genetics comes from. And this really long DNA molecule is pretty much made of a bunch of different segments called genes. So genes, they're not like a structure that's actually there, but if you just think about like from here to here, you can think of that as maybe like it could be a gene. So each gene usually has like a special sequence that codes for one particular trait. So let's say this sequence over here could code for a protein that digests milk. This or to here could be another gene that codes for something like how to digest sugar. Um, so each gene usually is responsible for one trait. And when I say trait, I mean one quality that distinguishes you as an individual. So this could be the usual qualities that you think about. It could be something like eye color or height. And it could also be something internal, like the ability to digest dairy. So if you know anyone who's lactose intolerant, then this means that they have a trait that is caused by a gene which doesn't allow them to digest lactose. You can say that is pretty much true. It can also control.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
genes
Mr.
genes
K.
are stop. Okay, genes are like ones where it's like it's just traits about you, like
Hi.
how wiz or like. Does it also affect? Does it
Yeah.
affect like how? Does it affect how like how you look, how things inside your body work, or how you will live? All
Yeah. So, like, yeah, good question. Anything you can think about, like anything that varies between you and someone else you know, that's controlled by a gene, like one gene or multiple genes. Okay. So, a gene, it's just like, uh, in your DNA, you just have certain sequences like called genes. That's what genes are. There's sequences of DNA, and each of those sequences of DNA is responsible for making a protein that affects a trait. So if you think about eye color, for example, I'll go into this. Eye color is caused by a pigment in your eye called melanin. So the reason that people have different eye colors is because the genes that control eye color are different between them. So the protein is made in different amounts. So that's why somebody who has blue eyes has a different amount of, like, has a different color than somebody who has dark eyes, because the dark-eyed person makes more pigment, and that's controlled by genes. Yeah, someone raised their hand.
genes like do genes. Okay. I'll let that person go.
Where are genes spread throughout your entire body?
Okay, so good question. Yeah. Every cell in your body, like every single cell, it has a tiny compartment in the center called the nucleus. So, I'll actually go off script for this. I'll search this up. Okay. So every cell in your body has a tiny compartment in the center called the nucleus. And inside every nucleus in your body is a whole really long molecule of DNA. It's not just one molecule, it's a lot of molecules, but if you just look at any cell in your body, like every skin cell, like on your skin, you can see if you can maybe pick off a cell. I mean, don't do that, but if you could, then in that cell would be all the DNA. So every cell in your body has all the DNA that makes up you. And the reason that cells are sometimes different, like your skin cell is different from an eye cell, is just because they read different parts of that DNA. And the DNA and genes are just like a certain segment in that DNA. Like if you consider a DNA sequence as an alphabet from A through Z, or maybe like actually a book, like a fairy tale book from the beginning to the end, then you can think about a certain cell, like the skin cell, only reading a few pages of that book. And that's why each of your cells are different. And because they're only reading a few pages, they're only reading a few genes. So your skin cells may only read the genes that make up the skin pigment, for example, if you know what I mean. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but like, are there like any DNA? So even cells. So technically, your brain,
Mm-hmm.
it it's made out of cells, right?
Yeah. Every organ in your body is made out of cells.
So even all the organs have DNA in them.
Yeah, exactly. So everything in your body has DNA, like every single cell. Because everything in your body is made up of cells, like your liver is an organ, and your organ is made up out of cells. Your eyes are organs and they're made up out of cells. Your skin is made up out of tiny cells. Everything in your body is made up out of cells. So first you should get that stuck in your head. It's a really weird thing to think about because you think of you as you, not a bunch of tiny, tiny little cells put together, but that's the truth. So anything that's made up out of cells, which is basically everything in your body, has all the DNA. And in the DNA are sequences called genes. So yeah, in your brain, you have genes pretty much because your brain is made up out of cells. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it
All right,
does.
awesome. Thanks for the question. So someone else had a question? They were talking. Um, okay. I could have sworn I heard somebody talking before he raised his hand. But it's okay. Just if you remember your question, just you can unmute yourself at any time and chime in, okay? So yeah. So like we are saying, a trait is just anything that distinguishes you from other people. And this could also include really important things, like not just eye color and height, which are little quirks that you have. It can also be really important things like how likely you are to get heart disease. Like if heart disease runs in your family, that means that usually your parents, like if your grandparents are likely to get heart disease, that means your parents might also be more likely to get heart disease, or you might if you're when you get older. So that's another thing controlled by genes. Pretty much everything is controlled by genes. So now let's move on to your DNA. So essentially, you have two entire copies of your whole DNA. You have one copy of your DNA from your mom and one copy from your dad. So this means that all the DNA that makes up you and every person on the earth, half of it is from their mom and half of it is from their dad. So just get that in your head. So let that sink in, okay? So you're made up of half your mom's genes and half your dad's genes. I'm sorry, your genes, all your genes are half made up of your mom's genes and half made up of your dad's genes. So, and since you have two whole copies of your DNA, how do each of your cells know what copy they should read? So imagine like if you, I can't find a picture, but yeah, if you consider this whole DNA molecule, you have like a ton of these, and that's your whole DNA. Half of those are going to be from your mom and half are going to be from your dad, okay? So in the nucleus, you have two copies. And if you have two copies, how do you know which one to read? That's what I'm getting at. So since you have two different versions of each gene, because DNA is just a bunch of genes, right? Genes put together. The DNA sequence is just a bunch of genes. Since you have two whole copies of these, there are some special patterns that control which one you read. So a pretty interesting way to think about this is if you have two really long receipts that represent, I guess, your mom's side of the DNA and your dad's side, then you can consider somebody like one person, you're like sitting there and you have these two different receipts and you need to control for each little segment of the receipt which one you look at, okay? So your body has like an interesting way of controlling this, and this is what we call inheritance. So this is how genes are passed on from parents to kids. So how like your if you have if you have a gene from your mom and a gene from your dad, like for eye color, which one you express. So if your mom has blue eyes and your dad has brown eyes, what color your eyes can be. That's just an example of inheritance. So your mom's copy and your dad's copy for a particular gene can be the same. They can have the same version of the gene, or they can also be slightly different. So an example is if your mom has brown eyes and your dad has brown eyes, then that means that their copy for the gene that would control eye color would be the same version. But if your mom has blue eyes and your dad has brown eyes, then that means they have different copies for the same gene that controls eye color. So again, just to reiterate, a gene controls one trait. So a trait is like eye color or height or something like that. But your mom has blue eyes, which is a version of eye color, and your dad has brown eyes, which is a version of eye color. So that's different versions of the same gene. So if you have different versions of a gene, it's this little funny word here. That's what we call them, alleles. So alleles is the particular version of a gene. So if your mom has blue eyes, you would say she has the blue eye allele for the eye color gene. So this is just a hypothetical. It's not just one gene that controls eye color, but yeah, we'll just use it as an example. So your mom has an allele for blue eyes and your dad has an allele for black eyes. Since you have one whole copy of your mom's DNA and one whole copy of your dad's, that means you have a copy of each of these alleles in all your cells. Because your whole DNA sequence, you have one from your mom and one from your dad. So you have, at a particular point in that DNA sequence, you have one little gene and you have two different versions. One is the blue eye allele from your mom, and one is the black eye allele from your dad. So that's what I mean by saying you have two different versions of each gene. So if you have the same alleles in your mom and in your dad, then what we say is that you're homozygous for that trait. So that means if your mom has blue eyes, that means she has a blue eye allele, and your dad also has blue eyes, which is a blue eye allele, then you would say that you are homozygous for the eye color trait. So homo means same, okay? And yeah, just think of it like that. It's a weird looking word, but homozygous means you have the same alleles. But if you have different alleles, like your mom has blue eyes, so she has the blue eye allele, and your dad has black eyes, so he has the black eye allele, then you're heterozygous. So just to reiterate, if you have the same alleles for a trait in your mom and your dad, then you're homozygous. So if you have different alleles, then you're heterozygous. And hetero means different here. So that was a lot of information. Any questions before we move on? All right. So just drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead if you have anything. So if someone is heterozygous for a certain gene or for a trait, they have two different alleles, right? You can only really express one of them, right? Because if your mom has blue eyes and your dad has black eyes, you have to have one eye color. You can't have both blue and black eyes. I mean, maybe you can, but let's just say you can't, right? Because for most traits, this isn't true. Like if your mom is tall and your dad is short, then you can't be tall and short at the same time. You're gonna have to pick one or the other, pretty much. Um, and we might get into height later because it's not exactly controlled by one gene. And remember that usually one gene corresponds to one trait, but it's not always true. Like for eye color or for height, for example, you have a bunch of different genes that control those traits. But yeah, let's just think about it as one gene for one trait from now on. So yeah, if you have two different alleles for a gene, you can only express one of them. So the one that we express is called the dominant allele because it dominates the other. So this means that if your mom has blue eyes, your dad has black eyes, if you have black eyes also, like as a kid, then that would mean that black eyes is the dominant allele. So if your mom has blue eyes and your dad has black eyes, the kid having black eyes means that the black eye allele dominates. Okay? So the one that is expressed is called a dominant allele when you have two different copies, and it's usually represented by a capital letter. So that indicates that it's the dominant version of that allele. And then you also have the one that's not expressed, right? So your mom blue eyes, your dad black eyes, and if you end up with black eyes, then that means that your blue eye allele, even though you have a copy of it, it didn't end up being expressed. So that's called the recessive allele. So keep in mind that that just means the version of that gene that even if you have it, it's just not being expressed because you have another version of that gene that dominates it, which is the black eyes. So we represent this one with a lowercase letter because it's a little, right? It gets dominated by the other one. So
What if there are two dominant ones?
yeah, good question. That's right on the next slide, I believe. There we go. Yeah. So the dominant allele, you would express this dominant allele like if you would have black eyes in two cases. So one of those cases, like I think Mel was saying, is if you have two dominant alleles. So if both your parents have black eyes, then that means that you have two copies of the black eye thing, the black eye allele. So you have the same allele for both copies, which means you're homozygous, and you have the dominant version of that allele. So the dominant version of the dominant allele in this case is the black eye allele, okay? So you're homozygous dominant. That's what you call it. It's a really big word, but the meaning of that is just that you have the same allele and you have the dominant version. So you represent that with two letters because you have two copies of each gene, right? So you have two different alleles. Your first allele is dominant and your second allele is also dominant. So yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask something? So does that mean that this is an example of people who have like color changing eyes?
So color changing eyes would be like something really complicated that we're not gonna cover in this basic thing, but I'll just explain it real quick. So eye color isn't exactly controlled by one gene, okay? I'm just simplifying it here. So in reality, color changing eyes are formed because there's like, I don't know, 20 different genes that control eye color. Like each of those genes adds a little bit of contribution to what eye color actually is. So maybe your parents have a special version of some of those genes, which causes you to have color changing eyes. Okay. And also on that note, let me just say that height, like how tall or short you are, is also not just controlled by one gene. Otherwise, we would only have tall people and only have short people. And like all tall people would be the same height, all short people would be the same height. It's not one or the other. You have multiple genes controlling height as well. So that's why you can be like, if your mom is short and your dad is tall, you're somewhere in between. Well, that's because height is controlled by multiple genes. So yeah, color changing eyes is just because there's a lot of different genes that control eye color, but we're not really going to get into that because we're just considering eye color as an example for like one trait controlled by one gene. So a great question, but we'll just ignore that for now for the purpose of teaching. So yeah, So the other case in which you would have the dominant thing expressed, the dominant allele, is in the case that you're heterozygous. So again, remember that heterozygous means that you have two different versions of the same gene. So your dad has black eyes and your mom has blue eyes. So that means that you would end up having black eyes. It wouldn't be somewhere between, in this case, where it's just controlled by one gene. Because if something is controlled by one gene, you can't have anything in between. It's just one or the other. So in this case, well, that's actually not true. I don't know why I said that. But in this case, it's just going to be one or the other, okay? So you have one dominant allele, which is the big B here for black eyes, and you have one little b here, which is blue eyes. And you're expressing the black thing, the black allele, and you end up having black eyes because this is the dominant allele. So if you think about it, there are two cases in which you express the dominant allele. If you're homozygous for it, so you have two copies of the dominant allele, or if you're heterozygous and you only have one copy. Either way, you're going to end up expressing this one because it dominates. And then you have recessive alleles. So what we said about recessive was if you have two different copies, it's just going to stay silent. It's going to stay repressed. It's not going to say anything. So recessive alleles are only going to be expressed if there are two copies of the recessive allele. So if you look here, you have two copies, and this would mean that you would only have blue eyes, in this case, in this example, you would only have blue eyes if both your mom and your dad had blue eyes. So you're only going to express the blue eye trait because if you have two alleles that are blue eye alleles, because it's recessive. If there's any other thing there, like for black eyes or whatever, then it's going to be silent. It's because the black eyes thing is going to get expressed. But in this case, you have two copies of the recessive allele, which is why this is going to be expressed. So again, remember that recessive alleles are only expressed if there are two copies of the recessive allele. So it's little b, and in big B, and big B, little b, in both these cases, the dominant trait is going to be expressed. Yeah.
Or what if you let's say you have a recessive, like blue-eyed allele, whatever that is,
Yeah.
and then you have a recessive black one. Which one is it gonna express? The blue or the black one?
What do you mean a recessive black one? Oh, okay. So yeah, so let me clear up that little confusion. So the one version of a gene, so like one allele, corresponds to one version of that trait. So if you have this allele, the black eye allele, then this means that anyone who has black eyes has this dominant allele over here. Okay, so it's going to be a big B. You can't have a black eye allele that's recessive because the nature of the black eye allele is that it's dominant. So it's just all blue eye people have two copies of this because all blue eye alleles are recessive and all black eye alleles are dominant. That's just what we're considering in this case. You can't have something like a recessive version of a dominant trait. You know what I mean?
Okay. But what if you had two different colored alleles, and they're both either dominant or they're both either recessive?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. So actually,
Which one?
Yeah, I know what you mean. So this is a very simplistic approach, like I'm saying again. And what Mel is mentioning is something called codominance. So usually genes come in this form where it's either a dominant thing or a recessive thing and only one is going to be expressed. But you can also have something really cool, which is called codominance. So that's CO, and then that's just dominance, okay? Codominance. And that's the case where you have multiple different alleles, and you don't have to express just one of them. You can express multiple of them. So an example of this is blood groups. So I don't know if most of you were there at the last class on this topic where we discussed like blood groups and forensic science. But for blood groups, you can either have an A, a B, or an O, and you can have any combination of those. So if you have an A allele from your mom and you have a B allele from your dad, then you would be an AB blood type. So both of those are equally weighted. Like both of them are equally dominant. So you would have AB. And if you had an A from your mom and an A from your dad, then that would make you just blood type A. So in that case, you can have different alleles and both of them are going to be expressed. So that's something I didn't really cover in this presentation because I thought it was a bit advanced. But yeah, you can also have cases where you have two alleles that are equally dominant. So you can have an A allele and a B allele for your blood type. And if you have both of them, then you're AB. If you have neither of them, then you're type O. If you have only one of them, then you're like type A or type B. And yeah, that's what I mean. So
Oh, okay.
yeah. Yeah, thanks for the question. That's an opportunity to go into something a little more advanced. So
But like, I've seen some people like their parents both had black hair, but then they had white hair or something like that. It's super rare, but like I've seen like one or two people with like that.
yeah, so okay, I'm gonna get back to that question in a little bit where we talk about like parents and children, like the traits. So that's gonna be in a few seconds when we get onto that slide, okay? And I'll say that, and then if you have a question afterwards, I'll explain. Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, here's just a visualization of what it actually looks like. I'm just talking about DNA and genes and traits like they're words, right? But this is what's actually going on in your cells. So DNA is coiled up like really, really tight into like really tight like a spring into these structures called chromosomes. So chromosomes are just these things that look like a little like legs, I guess. And if you zoom in really close, you'll see that it's just DNA wound up like really, really tight. And like I said, for each gene, you have two copies of it because you have a whole different copy of your DNA from your mother and one from your father. So that's why you have two copies of every gene. That's a really important concept. So right here, you have the same DNA from your mother and a similar DNA from your father. And in this particular region right here, you can consider it a gene that controls one trait. So in this case, this is actually genes for a plant. So this is a pea plant. And a pea plant has different colors of seeds, you know? Like you can have yellow peas, which you actually probably haven't seen before, and you can have green peas, which are the ones you usually see. So this is uh, this is a possible pairing up of the gene for the allele from a mother and the allele from a father. And if you look here, you would see that yellow means dominant and green means recessive. So in this case, what that means is, well, you might have seen this phrase before, homozygous dominant. So in this case, the pea plant, the kid, like the pea kid, I guess, has two copies of the same allele. It's the same version. So, and because this is the dominant one, um, it has two different copies of it, so it actually doesn't matter, but it has the same copy, right? It has the same copy here and the same copy here. So it's gonna end up expressing this dominant one. Because there's no one to argue with it, right? Like your mom says you should do this and your dad says you should do this, and they're saying the same thing, so you have to express that. So because this thing is homozygous dominant, it's gonna express the dominant trait, which in this case is yellow seeds. That's the dominant trait. And then you have this possible pairing up. So this is another situation completely different where the mom has this dominant allele, which is coding for yellow seeds. And the dad has this recessive allele, which is coding for green seeds. Well, in this case, it's heterozygous. So you have the mom saying something and you have the dad saying something. Which one is going to be dominant? Well, that's the one that's gonna end up being expressed. So in this case, you have the mom who's dominant. So the mom's trait is yellow, and therefore the expression for the kid is going to be yellow seeds. It's going to express the gene that makes it have yellow seeds. And the final case is where the mom has the recessive allele and the dad also has a recessive allele. So both of them have the recessive allele. So there's nothing to dominate it because both of them already have the recessive version. So because this is homozygous recessive, this is the one situation in which the recessive thing is going to be expressed. And if you're having a little confusion with this, remember that I said a while back here. So the dominant allele is expressed in two cases. It can either be if you have two copies of the dominant allele or if you only have one copy. And the recessive allele is only expressed if you have two different copies from your mom and your dad with the same recessive allele. So yeah, this is the gene controlling seed color. And you can see that you have three different scenarios here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. these are the 3 different cases. You can either have yellow seeds because you're homozygous dominant, yellow seeds because you're heterozygous and your dominant allele is being expressed, or you have 2 different copies of the green seed allele. So now coming back to the question that somebody was just asking, you can have 2 parents with their own copies of different alleles from their parents, and your parents had a child, right? That's you. So even though you're thinking about a kid having 2 alleles for each gene, like one from their mom and one from their dad, your parents also have parents, right? Like every human living has 2 alleles for each gene. It's not just kids, it's also adults because they were kids at one point. So when 2 people have a child, like your mom and your dad, these alleles combine in some way to create a kid who has 2 alleles for each gene. Because if you think about it, your mom has 2 alleles for each gene, and your dad also has 2 alleles for each gene. So that's 4 different possible combinations, right? Except you can only have 2 alleles for each gene. So if you think about it here, this is a little square that we call a Punnett square, and it's a useful diagram to determine the different possibilities of traits that a kid may have. So this looks a bit confusing at first, but just look at it here. So on the top, you have one parent. If you remember, a big R means that it's the dominant allele, and the little r means that it's a recessive allele. So that means that one of these people's moms had a copy of this allele. It's not a person, it's a P, but that P's mom had a dominant allele for this trait, and or the dad. Like one of the parents had a dominant allele, and one of the parents had a recessive allele. And for this P as well, one of the parents had a dominant allele and one of the parents had a recessive allele. So these are just the 2 different alleles that this P has for this particular trait. So this one just ended up having a big R and a little r. And this one also just ended up having a big R and a little r. So if you see here, there's 4 different copies of the same gene because each P has 2 copies of that gene with different versions. But a kid, like one individual P, can only have 2 alleles. They can't have 4 different copies of the same gene. They only have 2. So this means that random chance decides what combination of alleles each kid has. So the reason we have the square is it's an easy way to tell us the possible combinations of traits, or sorry, the possible combinations of alleles that a kid can have. So they can either have 2 big R alleles, because there's a big R here and a big R here, or they can take one big R allele and they can take a little one from the other parent, or they can, in this case as well, they can also take a big R from this parent and take a little r from this parent, or they can take a little r from this parent and a little r from this parent. So it's a pretty complex mechanism as to how they actually do this. It has to do with like the way cells divide. Except just think about it. You have 2 parents, each of you, and each parent has 2 different copies of one gene from their mom and from their dad. So there's 4 copies total, and you as an individual can only have 2 copies for each gene. So the only way for you to have 2 copies is if you eliminate 2 other copies by random chance. So you're just taking one allele from each parent with a 50-50 probability. So if you count here, you'll realize why usually homozygous traits are less common than heterozygous traits. That's right, why recessive alleles are often less expressed than dominant alleles. Sorry, ignore that. So if you see here, the only way that you express a recessive trait is if you have 2 copies of the recessive allele. So you have to take one from your mom and one from your dad. And there's only 1 of 4 cases where that's possible. Even if both your parents are carrying the recessive allele, there's only 1 of 4 chance, there's only a 1 in 4 chance that you would even express it, because you have to have the 50-50 chance of taking this one from your mom and the 50-50 chance of taking this one from your dad. And in all the other cases, you end up taking one of these big R alleles, which means that you end up expressing the big R trait. In this case, this is going to be the trait to have a round seed. And for having a wrinkled seed, the only way you would have that is if you have 1 copy from your mom that tells you to have a wrinkled seed, and 1 copy from your dad that tells you to have a wrinkled seed. So, yeah, that might have been a bit confusing. I'm sorry about that. But, yeah, So in the case that we're talking about earlier, somebody asked a question about this. So let's say your parents, they're expressing the dominant trait, which is black hair color, for example. I don't know. So let's say the dominant trait, the big R, is black hair, and the little r is red hair. Okay, so black hair is dominant, red hair is recessive. So in this case, if each of the parents had a big R and a little r, that means that they would have one copy of the gene saying, like, telling their cells to have black hair, and one copy of the gene telling their cells to have red hair. Yeah, Ganesh, I'll get to your question in a second. So that means that if you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, where the dominant is black and the recessive is red, then you're going to end up expressing the dominant one, right? We already talked about this. So if a parent had a big R and a little r, they're going to end up expressing the big R trait. So in this case, the big R is black hair. And same for the other parent. If the other parent has one copy from one of their parents saying they should have black hair, and one copy of the gene from their other parent saying they should have red hair, when it's put together, they're going to obey the dominant one. And the dominant thing is black hair, right? So that means that each of these people has something deep inside them. They have one copy of the gene that's not even being expressed, except this copy can still be passed on to their children. So that means that even though they're expressing the thing that shows that they have black hair, they're going to end up having the chance to give birth to a kid that has red hair. So I didn't exactly answer the question, right? I'm not sure what the colors were, but you can have parents that are expressing one trait because they have the dominant allele for that trait, but they can have children that have another trait because that's a recessive trait. So the recessive thing is just being repressed. It's silent because it's being dominated by the other copy of that gene. So that's why you can have two parents that are expressing a different trait, and then you have one kid that's showing a completely different trait than both the parents. And yeah, Ganesh, so if the parents have twins, then that means that each twin is genetically identical. So twin means they're exactly identical, like identical twins, which is what I'm assuming you're asking. That means they have the same exact genes as the other twin. So that means that they express the exact same traits. So that means that if one twin has a copy for a big R and a little r, the other twin is also going to have a copy for that big R and little r. So I know you might have questions, but we're running out of meeting time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the meeting right here, okay? And you can still like keep your question in mind, okay? I'm just going to end the meeting. We'll take a little break, like 1 or 2 minutes, okay? So join back in 1 minute, exactly, at the same meeting link, click the same meeting link, and I don't know, get a glass of water, get a snack or whatever, and meet back here in 1 minute, okay, guys? I'm going to end the meeting now. Hope to see you back. Adios.